Welcome back to the Mina Show featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast where one of the hosts thinks parlays should always have four legs. That's Lenny. I'm Mina Kimes. We are back to doing division previews, and I am so excited to have a repeat guest. I think this is your second time on the show, right? You did your first time for the draft because you are PFF's lead draft expert, but you also cover the league all year long. You are very, very close with one of the teams we're going to be talking about today. You have a history with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We are doing the NFC South, and I am joined today to preview this fine division by Trevor Sikkema of PFF. Welcome to the show.
Mina, is so good to be back. My sophomore episode here. And yes, I do have a close tie with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. If anybody can see in my camera right behind me over my right shoulder, that is a Gerald McCoy autographed football that I got when I was young, much younger, for Christmas one year. So I still have it. Multiple moves. I still got it. I got it up, fixing up the office. I feel like I had to present it for this episode here.
I feel like there aren't that many Bucs fans in media, so this is good. In the past, I've had Steven Ruiz, who's a Panthers fan, but he's like the most self-hating Panthers fan I know. So as much as I love him, I do want a little enthusiasm today because I do think this is an interesting division. I was, before we got on, I was complaining about a different division that should be remain nameless. Because it is a little bit boring, but this one is not. I actually think this division is really interesting. I think it's really winnable. We can kind of make fun of how winnable it is. I think that was sort of a joke last year, obviously. But it increases the stakes for every team involved. The other thing that caught my eye, Trevor, before we dive in, as I was preparing for this and going through the depth charts and the changes and the new coaches, all of these teams, Panthers, the Bucs, Saints, the Falcons, have new offensive play callers. And they're all sort of from the Shanahan tree, different kind of ways, depending on how you view, Canales and his time with Shane Waldron, for example. You got Zach Robinson, who's definitely, obviously, he was with the Rams in Atlanta now. With the Saints, they have Clint Kubiak, so that's a pretty big change there, too. And then finally, the Bucs, Liam Cohen, who again also was with the Rams. So these offenses could all look pretty different, but also kind of similar in a way.
It's true. I actually did not put that together kind of as I was going through this, and I did the same thing that you did. Note the new offensive play callers and everything, and I wrote down for all of them, kind of like where they're from and the tree and everything. But I did not click that they're all four here. It's like the Targaryens, right? I mean, we're eventually just going to become one family, and that's just going to be the dynasty, and it's just going to be the Shanahan, McVay, Targaryen dynasty that we have in the NFL because it feels like that's where we're going.
It's actually such a great analogy for those who haven't been watching House of the Dragon. There's a current plot line. This is not a spoiler. This is honestly, even if you haven't watched it, this isn't really a spoiler. One side, Team Black, is trying to find Targaryen adjacent humans to basically ride a dragon. And I do feel like that is like the NFL trying to find anyone from the Sean McVay tree to ride their dragon, call their offense. And that's how we get, who's the poor guy who died? Sir Stefan or something. I feel like that's like some, I don't want to name names, but like some McVay adjacent coach who's failed in the NFL.
And if you don't succeed, the fan base will burn you alive. So I think the analogy it's all right there. Yeah, that's very good.
Well, speaking of fan bases that are ready to burn everything, let's start with the Panthers. I feel like the Panthers have gotten the short shrift all off season. I've done these power rankings pods, Trevor, and we're going to do one more next week with Chris Long. The next one's going to be a little bit different. But the power rankings have finished 32nd thus far in every single power rankings pod, which is not outside the consensus at all. However, I do think there are things to be optimistic about. There are things that are interesting with this team. And I want to get into those because Panthers fans, you deserve it. You deserve a little cope. I don't know if I'm going to characterize this as cope, but I do want to talk about all the changes they made, particularly on offense, because this is an offense that not only has a new play caller, new head coach in Dave Canales, who very well from his time in Tampa. I want to talk about kind of what he did there and what he might do in Carolina, but also heavily invested in the interior of the offensive line. I think they have one of the most expensive offensive lines in football right now, as well as at the skill positions, combination of trading for a veteran in Deontay Johnson, but also drafting. This is a really young, really athletic group now. Xavier Legette, Jatavian Sanders at tight end, Jonathan Brooks at running back. So we can get into all that. I think, though, I want to start with the Canales aspect of it. Obviously, something that gets thrown a lot is he had a lot of success with quarterbacks in Seattle and Tampa. Was there anything you saw with him in Tampa that you think bodes well for Bryce? And also, is there anything about the offense that you think he should bring with him to Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, taking what Canales did in Tampa and trying to project it to Carolina is actually a difficult thing to do, because I think one of Canales's biggest strengths is that he is so fluid. Like, he is somebody who is very much a player's coach. He's going to listen to his guys. He's going to sort of assess their strengths and weaknesses. He's going to put them in all different positions to succeed. Like, it's not like Canales is we're going to run wide zone all the time. We're going to be a wide zone team, and we're going to stretch the field vertically, or we're going to be like a West Coast team, or like what. He doesn't really have this, just this certain thing that he gravitates towards. Even when he was at the beginning of his time in Tampa, it was so refreshing to, even before he called any plays, like in the offseason, he talked about how fluid that they were going to be. And it's funny because we talk about balance and what does balance really mean? Is it a different percentage of run versus pass, and, what type of run plays and how often you're setting things up and doing play action. Like, Tampa felt like they were dead in the middle, basically for most of the season in everything. How often they passed the ball, how often they ran the ball, how often they did play action. They were right around like 15 or 16th. It feels like every category. So for the first, I would say at least 10 weeks of the season, Canales is pretty much just trying to figure it out. Like, he was just trying to understand, because he was a first-time play caller last year, right? He had been involved in the offense when he was with Seattle, but he was calling plays for the first time. So not only was it Baker Mayfield's first time in Tampa, not only was it Dave Canales' first time in Tampa, like, they were all trying to figure it out at the same time. And I think they started to get in their groove once they really realized, okay, we've got to lean more towards the things that are doing well towards I would say from week 15 on, Baker Mayfield started to have a lot more success. Now, I will say it was good against the Eagles. They put up a great fight against Detroit when it was in the playoffs, but let's not totally forget week 17, where they had the chance to capture the division at home against the Saints, and they did not do it. Or week 18, where they traveled to Carolina, and it basically took an Antoine Winfield Jr. Superman punch at the goal line for them to basically win that game against what was the worst team in the NFL. So when I say that the second half of the season looked good, it's not without fault from this team. And I think that just goes back to the Canales conversation. It was so much experimentation that genuinely, I don't know what it's going to look like in Carolina, because he wasn't a heavy play action guy. But I don't know if he took that from last year and maybe learned his lesson and wants to do it more in Carolina, or pre-snap motion, same thing, or run pass, like how often he's doing both of those things. So it was just a really tough year to evaluate. And I hear him saying a lot of the same things with Carolina, where a lot of new offensive pieces, and he's sort of saying like, hey, we're going to figure this out. And I think it's a great mindset to have, but it does make it difficult to project exactly what his offense is going to look like, since last year was our only year and it was so fluid, I feel like, week to week with how he wanted to call the game plans.
I think your point about sort of I wouldn't say lack of an offensive identity, but the fact that the offense in Tampa, especially when it was clicking, did not look like the Rams at all, right? It was, I think nobody really knew what to expect out of Canales coming from Seattle, because he wasn't a play caller, because he had been associated with so many different play callers over the course of his career there. I think what you saw in Tampa, especially as the year went on, and is not only encouraging, but I think in terms of like how he approaches developing quarterbacks, but is so important for Bryce Young, is Baker Mayfield. I think when they hired him, I thought it was going to be like, oh, it's going to be like kind of like the Browns offense with Baker, that under center, play action, wide zone the boot.
Right.
And really, he was in the gun distributing, and that ball was coming out fairly quick, the quickest of Baker Mayfield's entire career. And he was kind of point guarding back there. Now, a lot of the offense, and I thought the FTN Almanac section on the Bucs did a great job of pointing this out, was extremely reliant on third down. They were very bad on early downs. Some of that to me is because they were so bad running the football. We're talking about the
Right.
Bucs a lot, but my point is, I think what I just said about Baker, getting Baker to play quickly, the fastest time to throw of his career, in the pocket, that's really what you want to see out of Bryce Young this season. That's probably the most important thing, because what we saw last year was a quarterback who held on to the football too long, wasn't throwing with anticipation by the end of the season
Right.
consistently, and didn't seem to have faith in the structure of the offense. So if you can get him playing quickly, I think that's the best situation for him. Another piece I'll reference, Nate Tice did a great piece on Bryce Young months ago. And one of the things he pointed out was one of the very few things that Bryce Young was good at last year was he was pretty decent and empty. This, the Bucs, I think, probably used the most empty out of, if not the most up there of any team in the NFL. That was another way in which, again, he just had Baker back there, ball out. And I think you really want to see something similar from Bryce this season. Because even if the offensive line plays better, and I do think they will play better because of the additions,
Right.
it's still, that to me was the single biggest reason why he struggled last year.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at some of the numbers that we have from our PFF database, O-line grade 60.5, that was 27th in the NFL. Pressured dropbacks, the Bryce was pressured on 310 dropbacks. That was dead last or first in the NFL, however you want to look at it. It was not good. He was pressured the most out of any quarterback, and the time to throw was higher because he felt like he was scrambling for his life. And going back to kind of what I was saying, that even though we don't know exactly what Canales is going to be schematically, who he is as sort of a player's coach, I think is going to be great for Bryce. Because if there's one thing to take away from the relationship that Canales had with Baker Mayfield and what Baker Mayfield has said about his success last season, he said himself, I was having fun. Like, it was fun to play football again. There wasn't like all this crazy pressure, and I wasn't trying to adapt to somebody else's offense. Like, people were trying to play around my strength, and they were making the game fun again for me. And I think when we looked at Bryce Young last year, he wasn't having a lot of fun, right? I mean, he looked extremely stressed out. He was not confident. Like you said, he lacked so much anticipation. He was second guessing himself all the time. And no matter where you were on the, where do you draft Bryce Young in the NFL type of a debate? Was it behind Stroud and Levis and Richardson or whatever? Or maybe you thought he was a number one overall candidate. When you looked at what Bryce Young did at Alabama, he wasn't winning with a big arm. He wasn't Richardson or Stroud. He was winning between the ears. He was anticipating. He was seeing things before it even happened. He was anticipating and had great accuracy and great ball placement and great timing through so many different things. He could escape pressure because he was confident. We didn't see any of that last year in Carolina. And I think there's a multitude of reasons why: the offensive line, the lack of separation with wide receivers. I think that it's an underrated part of development with a quarterback, especially when you talk about rookies getting drafted as franchise players, coming to a city. They're expected to be the savior. Their coaches, the owners, the general managers, their marketing person, their quarterback coach, their parents, their friends, everybody's pulling them in different directions. You're just trying to live life as a 22-year-old, right? And so I think there's so many things that go into it that Canales, to me, and how he understands players, is naturally going to be able to calm a little bit and hopefully get more confidence out of Bryce. And so schematically, whatever it looks like, I think he is just going to try to instill as much confidence in Bryce as possible, which is a big question to answer when it comes to the overarching question of, is Bryce Young the guy? Did we make a mistake, or is he truly our franchise moving forward? So that's sort of the relationship that I can take from what Canales was with the Bucs and Baker Mayfield, and what I'm hoping to see more of from Bryce this upcoming season.
So one key difference between the Bucs and the Panthers is the Bucs have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And I think the question of whether or not the Panthers have done enough to evaluate Bryce Young, play calling is one thing, protection is another. And I'll just stop right there on the offensive line. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time. I think they overpaid, but it was necessary, is kind of one of those things. Like, you can criticize it from a roster construction standpoint, but let's throw that out the window. And just the offensive line that they're fielding this year should be significantly better. Damian Lewis, guard with Seattle, he's decent. At minimum, he is an average guard. I think he can be a bit better, and he has been better. I think Robert Hunt is good when healthy. If you can get a Kwanu to play better, and he really, really struggled in the beginning of the year, and I think as the year went on, it was a little bit less disastrous. It should be a good group. So that's the offensive line. My question for you is, do you think they did enough at the skill position? So, I talked a lot when they traded for Deontay Johnson. I praised that a lot because, the number one thing with this receiver group is they just didn't have guys who could separate. He is, I think, an elite separator. I don't think he's an elite wide receiver, but I think he's an extremely, extremely good at getting open. This is always reflected in all the ESPN metrics that look at those things. So I really like that trade. Then you draft Xavier Legette, which is an interesting one because at the top of the second round, he is compared a fair amount to DK Metcalf, who of course Canales knows pretty well from his time in Seattle. You're a draft expert. I guess let me ask you this. Do you feel like Legette, Sanders, Brooks, all rookies, can be meaningful contributors early on? Do any of them jump out to you as being particularly important to the development of Young?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think all three of these guys can be starters at their positions in Carolina within, I would say, the next 2 years. Like whether it manifests itself here in their rookie season or it's at the beginning of next season, I think Sanders can be their starting tight end, absolutely. And, going back to sort of your original question when you started talking about the receiver room, sure, I mean, I guess they could have done more, but to me, it would have been at the sacrifice of what they did on the offensive line. And I think that they went into this offseason saying nothing really changes unless we can protect Bryce better. So even though, yeah, it's an overpay of their offensive line, like you said, they basically needed to do what they did in order to just improve it in some way, shape, or form, because, offensive tackles aren't necessarily growing on trees, and they weren't really in a spot to upgrade offensive tackle. They had Moton, which they weren't going to move on. Iquanu's just got to straight up play better. And then they went with some of the best guards that they were able to get on the open market. So I don't hate what they did there. And then if you supplement that being their primary mode of attack in the offseason, which I agree with, you look at drafting wide receiver with your first selection, Xavier Legette, like it sort of is what it was, right? They didn't have a first round pick, and so they had to get a little bit creative, and I know they bumped back up to go get him, but doing that and then going to get Deontay, who I agree with you, is somebody who has at least the potential and the athleticism to be a consistent open target. I think that's what they really hoped that Adam Thielen could be, as sort of that like nuanced veteran wide receiver, that he was always going to be open for Bryce. And it wasn't exactly that for them last year. Hopefully they think that he's going to play better, but I think they did all they could. If to answer your question, this was watching what the Panthers were last year, especially on the offensive side of the ball. And I think the reason why it was probably so frustrating for everybody in Carolina and visibly for David Tepper, as we saw a couple of times, is because he realized, I just drafted a quarterback number 1 overall, and I'm staring at a multi-year rebuild still. Like what we have done is simply not good enough. And so the receivers that they brought in, I think, was a really good jump start. It's not going to be the final pieces of wide receivers that they bring in. Even with Xavier Legette, I think that they would probably like to still get a star potential wide receiver 1 at the NFL level, maybe over the next 2 to 3 years. But I think that Legette could be a really good wide receiver 2 for them. I think that Sanders and his athleticism could be a great mismatch at tight end and a potential starter for Bryce to throw the ball to at tight end. And then Jonathan Brooks, to me, is the most underrated addition for this team.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Yeah.
I mean, before he
really
got hurt,
under the radar. Yeah.
Before he got hurt, unquestioned RB1.
RB1, yeah.
Unquestioned RB1. He was the best running back in the class, and he was one of the youngest. He had the least tread on the tires, so it's not like he's got all these injuries and all these carries coming out of college, because remember, he backed up Bijan Robinson for 2 straight years, and it wasn't because he wasn't good enough to play. It's because he was playing behind Bijan Robinson. But you watched him last year, the speed, the balance, the tackle breaking ability, some metrics that we love are forced missed tackles per attempt and yards after contact, really high at both of those metrics in our system. So again, this guy was very clearly RB1, and I still had him RB1 even after the ACL tear. So to get him where they did, I truly think he could be their impact back the second that he is healthy moving forward. And I think that's going to be huge for Bryce Young moving forward.
Yeah, let me wrap then by saying something that I think maybe this is the thing I'm most confident about with Carolina, and I could be wrong, but I don't know how the passing game is going to look. I like some of the decisions they made, but there's a lot of question marks. I think listening to us talk about Canales and Young and even the additions of skill player, anyone can kind of hear that the optimism is very cautious. But I actually think this could be a really good run game.
Yeah.
That offensive line. So Lewis is a good blocker. Robert Hunt is a very good run blocker. Ekwonu, his rookie season, I thought looked good. People forget that year the Carolina Panthers actually had a very, even after, you remember they traded Christian McCaffrey, they were still extremely good at running the football. And if Brooks comes back and looks like he did before his injury, I wouldn't be surprised if this run game looks pretty solid. And to your point, that would go a long way towards making life easier for Bryce Young. I'll also add about Brooks, he's not Jahmyr Gibbs or McCaffrey or whatever, but he can catch the football. It's more of like a check down
Oh,
thing,
yeah.
screens, but he's a very well-rounded back. So I really, really like that addition. Defensively, buddy, a lot of holes on this side of the ball. It's funny because they kind of outperformed last year in some ways. They were 17th in DVOA versus the pass, which surprised me actually. 32nd versus the run, very, very bad against the run. And they really just lost players. Ejiro Evero stayed on as defensive coordinator, which I think is kind of interesting. Guy who's talked about a lot as a future head coach. Not a lot to work with here. They did bring in like a lot of capable vets and guys that have played for Evero in particular in the past. Guys like Josie Jewell from Denver, Troy Hill, Jordan Fuller from the Rams, just, NFL players. But as far as like stars, I mean, Jadeveon Clowney was amazing last year with Baltimore, but he's obviously on the wrong side of 30. Asking him to be your number one edge rusher is a bit optimistic. What do you think is like, what does success look like for you on the defensive side of the ball for Carolina?
Yeah, I think that Evero did a good job last year. You mentioned, and I looked this up as well. I was kind of shocked at how well they did, and when it came to EPA per pass on the defensive side of the football, I was like, that's shocking. Top half of the league, okay, all right. But you're right. Defending the run was not great, and it's a defense that's lacking star power, right? I mean, especially with Luvu and Burns gone, who I think were two really important pieces to this defense. Derek Brown did a fantastic year last year, played a lot of snaps, was really great in run defense. He was good as a pass rusher, but there's only so much he can do. He was a much better run defender than J.C. Horn. I think he could be a fantastic corner in this league, but he's just been banged up. He's not available. So you go, where's the production coming from? And I kind of looked into Clowney because Clowney, it's a bit of a homecoming for him, right? I mean, he plays at the University of South Carolina, which is just over an hour away from where Charlotte is. He's from Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is just like 45 minutes from where Charlotte is. So whether it was a homecoming for like where he played high school ball or college ball, like this is truly a homecoming, him coming back to Charlotte. And I thought about, how well he played in McDonald's system and how they used him a lot with, stunts and with him being a looper and even with him being a crasher, just the creativity that they used with Jadeveon Clowney last year. And I found this quote from Clowney when I was looking that up, which is very interesting. And he was talking about his success last year. And he was talking about, like him. It was actually a question of whether or not he would be back with the Baltimore Ravens. And he said, I enjoyed coming to work. It made my life easier this year. That's probably why I played at a really high level, because I didn't have any pressure. I would just come in, have fun, just be myself and play ball. That's great. He's got a lot of pressure in Carolina. Like whether it's the hometown hero coming back home or the fact that you mention it, like he's basically it on the edge for them to get after the quarterback. So if you even want to look at the contract that they gave him, he's got a lot of pressure to live up to this year. So I don't know if that necessarily means that he's not going to play well or anything. I just thought it was very interesting that he talked about him not having to be the guy in Baltimore, and a big reason why he was able to play so loose and play so confidently. That situation doesn't exist in Carolina. So if that's the reason why he played well last year, it's not going to be the reason why he plays well this year. So that was also just something that was very interesting to me. But to like answer your question, long way around to answer your question, success simply looks like, hey, can you stay around middle of the pack defending the pass, which maybe we'll see. That would be a big win for them. And then can you get a lot closer to middle of the league when it comes to run defense? Can you play the run a lot better? Can you make sure that you're in the middle? A successful defensive season for Carolina is simply, can you be around middle of the league in both of those categories while you're probably going to load up on defensive players in the future?
Yeah, so much of this year for Carolina is oriented around Bryce. Obviously, that's all that really matters. And that's reflected, by the way, in the way they approached how they deployed their free agency resources and their draft picks. This is a team that knows what has to happen this year. You need your defense not to be so bad that your offense isn't stuck with bad field position and playing from behind and that kind of thing. And we talked about how, I mentioned, I think that the Carolina run game could actually be pretty decent. You can't put them in a situation where they can't run the football. So the hope is that they're not so disadvantaged by the defense situationally that the offense is compromised as a result. I think success also looks like finding a couple of players, getting a couple of players around, aside from Derek Brown, who feel like cornerstones.
Yeah.
Healthy J.C. Horn is obviously the number one thing. They picked up his 5th-year option, Trevor, which is, I have to think, pretty unusual for a guy who's played as little football as he has, but speaks to the level of talent he flashes in man coverage in particular when he's on the field. But his is a name that comes to mind. Otherwise, it's so many vets that it's hard. I get Xavier Woods. I think you're happy with what you got from him year one, and then you just need like competent play from these veterans. I mean, they're like opposite Clowney. You're looking at DJ Wanham. Chason is on the Panthers now. I don't know if you knew that.
Right.
That took me by surprise. Like, whoa, I missed that.
Right.
It's a tough group. It's quite a challenge for Ejiro Evero, but as you mentioned, I think they did outplay their depth chart last year. So
there's just two names. There's two younger names that I would bring to the table. One of them is Jamie Robinson, the safety that they have, who on the depth chart, he's not like listed as a starter right now, but he's a guy from Florida State who I liked watching his tape when he was coming out of Florida State. And I also really loved his podium session at the Combine because he talked about what it actually takes to be versatile. Like a lot of people say like, oh, safety, you play free, you play in the box, you can play in the slot, whatever. And he talked about how he took pride in being versatile, and he talked about the work ethic that you have to have. He's like, not only do you need to be athletic, but he's like, when I was at Florida State, he's like, on Wednesday, I'd be in the cornerback room in case they needed me to play slot. On Thursdays, I'd be in the free safety, I'd be working on free safety stuff. On Friday, I'd be working on strong safety stuff, like whatever it was. So the way that he approached the game really resonated with me. And so I'm interested to see if he gets a lot more playing time, maybe becomes a starter for them at safety. And then Tevin Wallace, the super athletic linebacker from Kentucky that they drafted, a little higher than I would have drafted him, but I understand what they're going for, right? Shaq Thompson's not getting any younger. Josie Jewell's the other linebacker. They need speed there without Frankie Louvu. So if Wallace can step up and give him that speed, I think that can mean a lot as well. So those two young guys I'm going to be keeping an eye out for.
Yeah, and that scheme, I mean, they're not going to be in base very much. So if you can just get one of those, like a young linebacker, I think, to step up and help them fit the run better than they did last season, that would go a long way. Like, as much as I love Frankie Louvu, that was not really, I wouldn't say he was miscast in the defense, in Evero's defense, but he wasn't like quite the kind of linebacker that they needed. So that would be huge for them if Wallace was. All right. Those are the Panthers. The Saints. Let's start on the offense. So I alluded to this new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak.
Mm-hmm.
This is interesting for a number of reasons. So Kubiak, for those who are not familiar, obviously his dad, Gary Kubiak, is one of the most important play callers of the last 20 years. We talked a little bit about sort of the uncertainty with Canales. We pretty much know what the Kubiak offense looks like. I think what is interesting is how that translates for this Saints team, which has been very different. Last year with Pete Carmichael, it was kind of a holdover from the late career Breeze offense, which I didn't feel like Derek Carr was actually super well suited for, honestly.
Right. Right.
So the biggest challenge for Kubiak is not, I don't think it's Derek Carr, even though we can talk about him and his performance last year. It's the fact that this might be, we talked about Carolina's offensive line and the investments they've made. This is probably the worst offensive line in the division now. So Ryan Ramczyk is not going to play this year, which means Talisa Fuanga, who they drafted in the first round, who's a right tackle, is going to play at left tackle, which means Trevor Penning, who they traded up to get at left tackle, then was benched, is going to, I believe, play right tackle. They also have Lucas Patrick. Interior looks a little bit similar, although I guess left guard, Nick Saldiveri probably, and then Ruiz and McCoy at center. I think that you got to start there, Trevor, which is this offensive line such a problem that it'll make the offense non-functional? And is there anything Clint Kubiak can do to sort of mitigate the challenge presented by this line?
Yeah, I mean that's the big question, right? I think that because of how bad this team is on both of the trenches, this is a sneaky team to pick in the top 10, maybe even top 5 of the NFL draft. Like, I think there's a lot of talent on this team, but certainly for how things went for the Saints last year, there's a potential for things to go off the rails. And I feel like we're sort of like teetering right there with the Saints. And I think the offensive and defensive lines are a big reason why. And on the offensive side of the ball, I love Tulise Fuanga. Like, I really wanted him to get a shot at offensive tackle in the NFL, and he certainly is, and it's going to be in week 1, but I didn't want it to come at the expense of, well, now you got to play Trevor Penning because you don't have Ryan Ramczyk either, right? So I think that's going to be tough for them. The Saints offensive line, even like when healthy last year, it just wasn't good. And so it's hard to project that offensive line is going to be really good for them. Something that I looked up, which I was sort of surprised about, is San Francisco didn't run nearly as much play action, I thought, last year as like they could have. But they were number 1 in EPA per play when they were passing off of them.
I skipped over. Clint Kubiak was a pass game coordinator for San Francisco. I should have mentioned that.
Yes. There you go. Okay. Yes. There you go.
When I was talking about his resume, who he is, I left that out. Yeah.
So, I mean, they didn't run it as like from a volume perspective, maybe is the way that you thought, but like he was very clearly great at dialing it up. Like he knew how to dial it up at the right times. And to me, the way that you kind of mitigate an offensive line that you don't love in front of you is you got to dress it up a little bit, right? You got to create some of that confusion, a little pre-snap motion, getting guys in motion, moving spots, play action post-snap. Like, you've just got to get a little bit of hesitancy somewhere, even if it's just from the linebacker level. Like, even if the defensive line is going to come at you no matter what, you just got to make sure that those linebackers, maybe for a split second, are like, wait, am I going all out here? And so I think the way that you do that is you've got to do what Clint Kubiak certainly knows how to do. And to me, that's how you mitigate what is the biggest question mark of the Saints. Because like I said, you could point to a lot of different talent, right? I think there's guys on that team, even on the offensive side of the ball, they could still get it done. But that's the big worry. Can the offensive line handle what it needs to? Can Trevor Penning really take that leap in consistency? Can Talise Fuanga hit the ground running and be able to acclimate to NFL life? Because remember, I love them. I wanted him to get a shot at tackle, but there were some NFL teams and there was some talk about him pre-draft as he's a guard. Like, he doesn't have the footwork. He doesn't have the length to be able to play a tackle. So now you're going to be figuring out the answer to those questions week 1, and maybe you didn't want that as early as week 1. So that's sort of how you do it to me is you've got to be able to get creative with how you dress things up and create that hesitancy from the defense.
So you talked about how the San Francisco offense didn't use as much play action, but how very good they were when they did. Who do you think was number 1 in QBR when he used play action last year?
Well, because you're bringing this up, it's like, is it going to be Derek Carr?
Derek Carr!
Oh my gosh!
So they didn't use it a lot, and I think that so there's a bit of a small sample size, but it was actually they used it at the lowest rate in the NFL, but it's still a decent amount of dropbacks. And I think part of the reason why it helped the offense so much is it did help what was a sus pass protection last year, and I think what we both agree is going to be sus pass protection this year. But Derek Carr, like, here's the thing about him in his career, when he's kept clean, he's still an accurate quarterback who can attack downfield, and the Saints have a very good wide receiver group. maybe not very good, but I think Olave,
It's
Rashid
good.
Shaheed is really good. Rashid Shaheed to me is a totally solid number 2. The dude can
Yes.
absolutely stretch the field. He's not just like a track star too. He can make difficult catches, and then I think number 3 you're looking at either Cedric Wilson or A.T. Perry, who I like. Point is
Mhm.
this though. I don't think either of us are worried about that group of pass catchers getting open. And I don't think either
Right.
of us are worried about Derek Carr's ability to throw it to him. We're just worried about whether he's going to stay upright long enough to do so. So I'm totally with you on play action. Marshall Newhouse came on the show and talked a little bit about the way he thought the scheme would help the Fuanga and the offensive linemen who he thought would be a good fit for it. So that's really the hope here. Whether or not the scheme can protect the offensive line to the point where this offense is functional, I think is an open question. I truly don't know. I think like we can talk about, some of the ways in which they can mitigate that challenge, but you can't. Play action isn't just a button you can press and suddenly your offensive line is fixed. Like,
Right.
you know,
Right.
they're still going to be up against it, and I don't think Derek Carr at this point in his career, I don't feel comfortable betting on him playing behind a bad offensive line. So for me to be confident in this offense, the offensive line would have to supersede expectations. Fuanga would have to be good immediately, and Kubiak would have to help them. Now, if all that
Yeah.
happens, there's pieces.
And I don't really know how much to make of this, but the Saints did end the season pretty strong on offense. It was a
Yeah.
roller coaster. It was sort of a struggle to start the season, but 5 of their 6 highest graded offensive performances that we had at PFF came after week 8. So like second half of the season, they had their best offensive output. So, new coordinator obviously changes sort of all around. How much weight do you put into that? I'm not sure, but this is all of a sudden, you talk about some coaches who are kind of on the hot seat. I think that Allen is a little bit for how long that he's been in New Orleans. Do they want something new? It sort of lines up a little bit with Derek Carr's contract as well, because I'm looking at over the cap right now. Like his contract and his cap number is 12 million this year. It goes up to 51 in 2025 and then 61 in 2026. Now, they can cut him next year and actually save money on the cap, but it's 50 million in dead money. So the Saints, strangely enough, with the parallels to Sean Payton, could be looking at a situation much like Denver was this past offseason, where if things don't go well in New Orleans, like if they finish third in the division and they're not really close to the playoffs and they're not really close to the division, and they're like, we're blowing it up. We're moving on from Derek Carr. We're moving on from Dennis Allen. Like like I said, like if they're a team that ends up getting like a top 8 pick and they're just blowing it all up, they really might be looking at a situation like what we saw with Denver, where they go, we don't care what the quarterback contract is. We got to move on. We're taking a huge dead cap to be able to move on from him. So I think the outcome for what could be with this Saints team is all over the place when it comes to the offensive output.
I have Rattler on my dynasty team. I have Derek Carr on my dynasty team. That's why I drafted Rattler as a hedge.
Smart. It's a good move.
Give me. I just need like a few really good preseason performances to get the
Rattler was
going.
so underdrafted.
Right?
Like
5th round? Come on.
With a steal to get him in the 5th round. I think that's a great spot.
So on the other side of football is actually kind of similar. You alluded to this. This is a team that's not good in the trenches on either side, but I think we like their wide receiver groups and their corners. Their secondary is good still. And they added to that secondary with Kool-Aid McKinstry, which I thought was another really good draft pick. I think he might play nickel for them, compete with Alante Taylor. But you have Lattimore and Adebo on the outside, still a very good group. Tyrann Mathieu still playing well. I think Jordan Howden, who is pretty decent for them, is going to be safety opposite him. Linebacker, still a position of strength. The ageless Demario Davis. I can't wait to see where he comes in on the NFL 100 so I can complain about it immediately. Okay, so the Saints defense kind of fell off a bit last year finally, right? They kept finishing the top 10 and then finally you fell off, still 12th in pass DVOA. But
I was going to say still better than I thought.
Yeah, despite the fact that they have like no pass rush, which we could talk about. My theory is that if you have like a Demario Davis or a Levante David or one of like those dudes, like those middle linebackers, you're always going to be pretty good. I think it's like such an important position in the NFL right now. If you just like, for example, this is like one of my favorite. This is such a Demario Davis stat. So FTN does like DVOA versus different positions. The Saints were very good against number one wide receivers, less so against number two, very bad against the slot. That reflects what you see. Third in DVOA against passes to running backs. That's a Demario Davis stat. There's so many like little like. Yeah. They're great against screens. They're great against short passes. They're just so good. The problem is they can't get after the quarterback. So Davenport's out. He was out last year. Sorry. You signed Chase Young on a 1-year deal. Otherwise, though, you got Cam Jordan, Carl Granderson. It's like a lot of young guys like Peyton Turner, Foskey, who haven't really. I think they did get, I think Brian Bresee, who's a defensive tackle from Clemson, actually gave them some production last year, especially as the season went on. So, but I feel like, Trevor, for me to believe this defense can bounce back, one of those guys, whether it's Bresee, Foskey, Turner, whatever, somebody needs to make a leap this year, because otherwise there's no reason for me to believe this pass rush is going to be better than what they've been, and what they've been is bad.
Yeah, I mean that was my big note that I had when I was sort of studying this team and getting ready for this show. Is a big question that I have right here is who's getting after the passer on this team? Who like, I think Carl Granderson had a really good year last year because there were splash plays, like important plays that he made. But when you look at this team as a whole, 29th in the NFL in sacks, 25th in pressures, 23rd in pass rush win percentage, and the only player who was a regular starter for them who had a pass rush grade above 70 was Nathan Shepard. That's it. Everybody else was lower than 70. So they're certainly hoping that Chase Young can look anything like the Ohio State Chase Young, which I don't know if that's going to be the case here in the NFL for him, but they need somebody to get after the passer because they also didn't blitz a ton. When I looked up blitzes, I was like, okay, the defensive line is not really getting home. How much do they blitz? Because kind of going back to your Demario Davis point, if you have Demario Davis, it feels like it should free you up. Like you could send a little bit more towards the pocket because he's got things handled in the middle of the field. And they didn't do that. They blitzed. They were the 24th highest blitzing team in the NFL during the regular season. And so I just, that's again, my big question, and why I think it's crazy when people are like, whoa. You're thinking the Saints could be picking in the top 8, the top 5. I don't know what I'm getting out of these trenches. And if the trenches really fall off for this team, yeah, all of a sudden, I think that things could get bad for them. So somebody's got to get after the passer, whether Bresee takes the next step, whether it's Foskey. I like Christian Boyd, who they drafted as well, whether it's Chase Young. They've got some veterans that they can kind of play as starters on the on the defensive line to start. But somebody's got to become an X factor for them by the middle of the season and during the second half of the season, or they're just not going to have enough juice to beat the better teams in the NFL.
This sort of feels like, and we can wrap here, the 2024 Saints in a nutshell. Like, if young players on both sides of the ball in the trenches outperform, absolutely they can win this division. If Fuaga is amazing, or even competent, honestly, right? Who's the left tackle, and then on the other side of the ball, if one of these guys, these younger guys, becomes a double-digit sacks player, then yeah, because the receivers are good, linebackers are good, the corners are good, the quarterback is competent with protection, but the problem is the trenches, and I think that's like a pretty fair assessment of this team, and also a good reason to be dubious, frankly, because it's all speculation at this point. All right, let's take a quick break. Let's come back and let's get to the division winner. Why should you bet with Caesars Sportsbook? 2 words, Caesars Rewards. Every bet brings you closer to the types of benefits only Caesars can offer. Hotel stays, VIP experiences, sports and concert tickets, and more. It's not just an app, it's an empire. Trevor, I feel like everybody's forgotten that the Bucs won. The Bucs won the NFC South, guys. They're not being talked about in that way. And they're kind of running it back. Really, I was, kind of looking at the depth chart. This is like a very, very similar team to the team we saw last year. Some changes, but nothing dramatic. The bigger change to me is the coaching change. And I think that's where we should start with the hiring of Liam Cohen. It's funny because we kind of talked about it in a roundabout way when we talked about Dave Canales and what this offense looked like. But I think it's worth mentioning because Cohen, again, going back to the Rams tree, it seems like his offense is much more McVay-ish. What he did at
Yes.
Kentucky, what he did, the way he talks about it. I read someone for Bucs.com, shoot, I wanted to write down his name, did an excellent piece. Scott Smith had an excellent piece because I was trying to like read interviews with Cohen just to get a sense of like what he's saying about the offense. And he did a really great piece about like Liam Cohen's offense and the things he said and the way and everything in this piece, the way he talked about it, his quotes lead me to believe this offense is going to look a little bit more Ramsey. This was the Bucs used very spread out formations. Cohen talked about going a little bit more condensed, using more motion, which is not something that the Bucs did. Running from under center more. So I have mixed feelings about this, and I really want to hear what you think because this is an offense that we've seen have incredible success lately with. This is the reason why all these coaches are getting hired. But I do think Canales hit on something with Baker, putting him in the gun and, getting him to distribute more rather than that under center play action. So like, do you feel like the offense should depart from what we saw last year because of the success they had with Baker? Are you wary of changes, or do you think that, this was obviously a very horrible, not obviously, but it was a horrible run game. Do you think changes are necessary? Because as good as we saw, as much as Baker played better last year, I alluded to this, FTN pointed this out, this was a very bad offense on first and second down that was very reliant on third down, which tends to not be sustainable year to year.
Yeah, no, I think that you are right in your sort of observation that Baker played a lot better in the gun. I think they're going to keep that. Now, I don't know what the percentage of that is going to be like. I don't know how much they're going to integrate running the ball under center, but I think a lot of the offense is going to be Baker operating from the shotgun. You brought up the title point guard before when you were talking about it earlier when we were opening up the podcast with Canales and Baker with the Panthers, but I think that that's kind of what it comes down to is Baker feels more like this sort of field general point guard, and he feels more comfortable distributing the ball when he is from the gun. So I think that we're going to see that a lot more. I think you're right. I think we're going to see more condensed stuff. It is going to look more McVay. When you look to even beyond when Cohen was with the Rams, if you go back to when he was the offensive coordinator with Kentucky in 2021 and then Kentucky again in 2023, Kentucky was top 30 in the Power Five, so top half of those teams in the Power Five when it came to play action usage. And so, like, I think that that's something we're going to see a little bit more of because I mentioned Canales, it felt like was right in the middle of everything. It didn't feel like there was a true identity from them throughout the season. And I think that Cohen, where he's not going to all of a sudden vault the Bucs into like top 5 play action rate or like top 5 motion rate, I think it is going to be a little bit more of that just because he has more of an affirmed identity in what he wants to do on offense. So look, I think that they, talked with Baker. Well, I don't know if they could have actually talked with Baker about it because he was still a free agent, but I think the decision to get Liam Cohen was heavily influenced by who could have worked with Baker because it felt like this was a deal that was going to be made all along. So when they were interviewing candidates to be the offensive coordinator, I think that familiarity of when Cohen was with the Rams and Baker had his little stint with the Rams as well, getting to know him, I think that is something that chemistry they're going to be able to sort of hit the ground running with pretty quickly. And I think what goes into that is, again, the styles of where you put Baker on the field. And to me, I agree with you. I think that that's going to come from more of the shotgun. Now, they're going to continue to try to run the ball more because that's sort of like what Todd Bowles teams do. Now, Todd Bowles says that he's hands off and he lets Canales do it and he's going to let Liam Cohen do it, but he likes to keep things pretty balanced, especially being a defensive guy. He doesn't want just a gas defense out there because the offense is passing a little bit too much. He wants to control the clock. He wants to control the motion of the game, if you will. And I think that can look a little better this year because the Bucs were terrible on the interior offense.
Hard to be worse running the ball on early downs than the Bucs.
It really is, especially between the tackles. I mean, they just were getting whooped up front. Center, left guard, right guard. It didn't matter. They were one of the lowest graded interior offensive line units in the NFL. If they weren't last, they were close to last.
Rashad White led the league. This isn't they did it. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to create a NGS next gen stats metric for runs where the average dad at home is like, that's not going to work, because I know Rachaad White would rank first. That dude, they were just slamming him up the interior on first down, and now
And they
you get
kept
to the
doing it.
interior, and they kept doing
And
it.
and
It
they
was
and
so
they just
obviously not going to
they
work.
just
Sorry,
they just
retroactively
kept
mad.
doing it. And that's what makes me feel like they're going to continue to run the ball a good amount, because they very clearly were not afraid to do it when it was not working. So now it should be working a little bit better. Like I said, they've added Graham Barton. They drafted Graham Barton in the first round.
Good.
I think Cody Mock is going to play better this year. Really struggled last year, but you got to think about Cody Mock's journey. Like, he was a tight end at North Dakota State, and then they moved him to tackle, and now they're moving him into guard. It's like that, like, the progressive strength that is needed to play each of those positions. It was always going to be an acclimation period for him, and they kind of threw him out there because they wanted to. But left guard spot, that's going to be the big training camp battle, if you will. Sua Opeta and Ben Bredesen, those are going to be the two guys that are going to be competing for that left guard spot. And I think Cohen has said this himself. The player who will be the better run blocker will basically get that job, because they obviously want to do that. Now, both of those guys, most of their career, haven't really graded well as run blockers, but each of them had one season. Funny enough, I think it was both the 2021 season for both of these guys, like, as their best run blocking season, but it was, a grade in, I think, the mid 70s for both of those guys. So I think that's what it's going to come down to. Whoever can run block the best, because that's still what they want to do. And I think that's probably going to be a little bit of a synopsis identity of what it could be under Cohen.
Well, one player who I do think will benefit from that change, as well as the condensed formations, is Chris Godwin, who they lined up outside last year. They sort of flipped his snap count in terms of he was outside about 2/3 of the time, in the slot about 1/3. It was flipped from the year before. And I can see why they did that. He's getting a little older, and maybe, they want him, maybe it had to do with like the makeup of the receiving group. That dude's best in the slot, aligned close to the formation, getting his nose in it. I mean, I think that was sort of a component of the offense too that was like a little bit missing, that sort of, because a lot of the early down stuff, if I remember correctly, was, especially the quick game stuff, it was a lot of just screens and, little hitches and whatnot. And I think you can work the middle of the field a bit more with Godwin, and then have Trey Palmer or Jalen McMillan, who they drafted out of Washington, who I think can be like a classic Z as the third receiver. I mean, it's a good group. I'm pretty optimistic generally about this offense. I think I like the hire of Cohen. I think I know we're talking about the offensive line and how bad they were run blocking the inside, but honestly, the work that this team, that Jason Light has done rebuilding that line, given the incredible amount of retirements and whatnot and injuries, is pretty remarkable. There was a point watching in the last year where I was like, I can't believe, when they switched Wirfs to the left side and Luke Gadecki from guard to right tackle, I was like, I can't believe this is working. But they somehow
Right.
it actually worked. And
Yeah, I was nervous. I was nervous about it.
So defensively, not a ton of changes. The biggest, the Carlton Davis is out. So Zion McCollins escalated full-time starter on outside corner. He kind of played a lot last year anyways. Shaq Barrett is gone and then retired. So Yaya Diaby, I guess, is the number one edge. It's this, there's some similarities with the Saints here. A lot of similarities, actually, in that they've got like the amazing aging inside linebacker. I actually think we didn't talk about the Saints interior linebackers. I think some of the other linebackers are good. I feel the same way about the Bucs. That dude KJ Britt, I thought, played really well last year. That's why Devin White's no longer on this team. Secondary, you've got one of the, if not the best safeties in football, and Winfield Jr., who makes everything else a lot easier. Corner's a little bit dubious. But again, and I'm just going to say the same thing I said with the Saints, with their pass rush. I mean, edge. It's similar because they've again, like New Orleans, they've drafted Chris Baswell this year, but they just haven't. It's so different from when you think about that Super Bowl team and just Shaq Barrett, who I just mentioned, and the amount of sacks they got from the edge position. This team is still looking for answers there, Trevor.
Yeah, no, I mean, They are. That's the biggest question mark because they've tried to throw a lot of different players at it, right? I mean, obviously, like Shaq Barrett was big for them. You know, I would say like 4 or 5 years ago, and even like during the Super Bowl run. But since then, I mean, they drafted Logan Hall pretty high because they wanted him to be sort of this like inside out defensive lineman, and they were hoping that like added speed would he'd be able to get to the quarterback, and he really hasn't. I think they thought they got a steal in Joe Tryon-Shoyinka from Washington a handful of years ago, and he just has not developed. I mean, he's fine, but he has not developed into the sort of edge one potential player that they have wanted him to be. Yaya Diaby, I am very intrigued by because I think he has the athletic profile to be a difference-making edge rusher at the NFL level, but the nuances and the sort of like the pass rush plan, if you will, of consistently getting into the backfield, that still needs some developing with him. I know he finished the season with a decent amount of sacks, but a good amount of those were kind of like longer sacks or cleanup sacks from him. They weren't these true, like, immediately one-on-one getting into the backfield. So even there's a little bit of a projection with him. When you look at this defense, on all three levels of the defense, they have a star, in my opinion, right? It's Vita Vea in the middle on the defensive line. It's Levante David in the middle of the linebacker unit. And then it's Antoine Winfield Jr. In the secondary. And so when you have those studs at all three levels, you still have the ability to really put a good defense out there. And I think that's what we saw last year. But there's no doubt about it that where are they getting pressure from on the edge is going to be paramount. And then can Jamel Dean play like a consistent CB1? Because there have been times over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years when Dean has actually like outplayed Carlton Davis. There have been, he's been making flash plays, but now Dean is the guy, right? Like Davis has sometimes been, I don't know. I don't know if this is 100% true, but I've always felt like Davis was the guy who, if the other team had a wide receiver that you wanted to employ like a shadow strategy to, it was Davis who was the one who was doing that. And without him now on the roster, I know people can look at it and say, hey, he's been hurt over the last couple of years. He hasn't been playing to the same level. And I agree with that. But with his presence not there, now you are leaning on Dean to have that role full time. And I wonder if he's going to be up to the billing for that. And I wonder if Zion McCollum is going to be up to the billing of being a full-time CB2 as well. Now you've also got questions kind of in the slot. Christian Izien played well last year as an undrafted free agent, but he kind of started the year hot and then sort of came back down to earth a little bit, as all rookie corners tend to do in the second half of the season. They draft Tyke Smith from Georgia, who's listed as a safety, but he's more of a slot corner. He's a bigger slot corner who can go up against tight ends. He can help you in run fits, things like that. But that's sort of a battle as well. So you kind of you've got middle linebacker figured out, interior linebacker, because you got KJ Britt and you got Levante David. You've got interior defensive line figured out because you got Vita Vea and you have Kalijah Cansey, who I think are going to be an awesome 1-2 combo as long as they're fully healthy this year.
I liked what I saw.
And then on the back end, on the back end, not only do you have Antoine Winfield Jr., but you're reuniting him with Jordan Whitehead, who played really well when he was in this Todd Bowles defense together, and he was part of that Super Bowl team with them and Mike Edwards as well. So it's almost like if you're looking at the depth chart or you're looking at them on the field, if you just draw a straight line from where the ball is, you're good. You like the interior, you like the interior, you like the interior.
It's interesting, Trevor, you bring that up though, because like I think about teams with an elite spine, like Baltimore is the one that always comes to mind. And schematically, they're so different from Tampa, which plays much more close. I mean, they play a lot of cover 3, typically with Antoine Winfield Jr. manning that free safety role, and he has the range to do so. But they are, and they blitz a great deal, obviously. Probably, we always think about that with Todd Bowles, but some of it is out of necessity because of, I think, the lack of talent at edge. But I do wonder, with that, the spine being such a strength of the defense, if they do need to evolve a little bit schematically. I thought watching them in the playoffs against Philadelphia, I thought and this is, by the way, credit to Todd Bowles, who I still think is like a very, very brilliant individual game planner. And the way they approached playing the Eagles, I thought was so smart with those 5-man fronts. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if this year you do see maybe like a little bit of a change with how they approach their fronts, because they're so strong on that interior. It's just outside of that defensive
Mhm.
tackle group that you start to get worried. It's tricky. It's a tricky one. It's again, it's kind of similar to the Saints where you really need like one of those guys, whether it's Braswell or Diaby, who you talked about his sacks being a little bit inflated. The advanced numbers did not really love his rookie year. Pass rush win,
Mhm.
sack to pressure rate, all of that. So yeah, it just feels like one of those guys is gonna have to step up for this
Yep.
defense to finish in the top 10. All right. I think we can all agree though that they're better than the defense of the next team we're going to talk about. Falcons, man. It's so we're past the draft. Draft is over. But as we reckon with this team, this depth chart, it's hard not to think about the draft, especially when you look at the defense. Let's start with the offense, though, because this offense could be great. So
Yeah.
I've been talking about all the different play callers. This is Zach Robinson again. Rams. It's funny, I mentioned with the last two quarterbacks we've been talking about with Derek Carr and then Baker Mayfield, I've kind of raised the question, but is it the right offense for them? How do you optimize them? It is the right offense for Kirk Cousins. We know that this is the right offense for Kirk Cousins. This is part of the reason why everybody loved the signing so much, because you had
Right.
proof of concept with Kirk Cousins in Minnesota, where they the highest under center rate of any quarterback in the league. You saw how efficient he was, play action pass. Couple Kirk Cousins 2023 numbers. He played 8 games, I think. First in completion percentage over expected, first in on target rate, second in QBR when kept clean. One that
Mhm.
really jumps out to me and I think is really relevant for this coming year. He had the highest EPA per dropback and the highest on target rate and the highest QBR in the NFL on throws between the numbers. This Falcons offense is going to live between the numbers if everything goes right.
Sure. And, thinking about where Zach Robinson, their new offensive coordinator, is coming from, it's LA. It's a spot that ran a lot of condensed things, a lot of 11 personnel, right? I think that they were first in 11 personnel and like almost last in 12 personnel. And it's kind of funny because last year the Falcons were first in 12 personnel and almost
Right.
last in 11 personnel. So it's just like the complete opposite switch. But yeah, I think the fit of Robinson, PFF alum, shout out. I think that him being in Atlanta, I think it's a really good combination with him and Kirk Cousins. And when you look at this team, this is one of the teams on paper that you think it should absolutely have a massive jump. I mean, the Falcons were 26th in the NFL in total points per game last year. This is a unit that I could very easily see being in the top 10. Not only do you add Kirk Cousins, but the offensive line was fantastic last year. I think they are still going to be fantastic this year, even with sort of the scheme changes. You have Kyle Pitts, you have Drake London. Now you also have Darnell Mooney, who I think a lot of people forgot about. I'm not so quick to write off Darnell Mooney. I think that it was just a lot of turmoil of what happened in Chicago. And I still kind of hold to that really good year that he had 3 years ago now. And I think that Atlanta is a really good spot to sort of unlock that talent once again. And I think you see that in the deal that they gave him. I like Rondell Moore as well. I was a big fan of his coming out of the draft. So I love the fact that he is on the team. And obviously you got Bijan and Tyler Algier coming out of the backfield. So to me, like, this is such a complete offense. It gives you the ability to attack the field in so many different ways. You talked about, okay, really being able to attack over the middle. You got guys to do it, right? I mean, you talk about Drake London and what he could be as a contested catch player. You talk about Darnell Mooney and setting him up and mesh concepts and crossers and being able to get him one-on-one and being able to attack and get the ball over the middle for great yards after catch. Obviously, you hope that Kyle Pitts is sort of there as well, where this is the biggest year for him yet. I think looking over the middle means looking at Kyle Pitts as a skinny post and a seam player quite a bit. And I think that they're going to, right, as a fantasy
Crossers.
owner. And
If Kirk Cousins doesn't throw at least 2 crossers to Kyle Pitts a game, I'm gonna be so mad. Which, by the way, if you go back to his rookie season, best in the NFL of any tight end on in breaking routes.
it's just it goes so well with what he does, right? I mean, like being able to win off the line of scrimmage very quickly, getting defenders in trail, being able to continue to keep the separation distance, like just get him the ball in stride. He'll
Yards
give you the
after
yards after the
catch.
catch, So,
Yes.
right, it's all there for him, and this is a unit that, in theory, should be a top 10 offense in the NFL. Now, whether their defense can hold up or not to complement that, to make them a division winner and a playoff team, I think that's a conversation that we'll have in a little bit. But it's so hard to look at this offense and not get excited about what could be there in Atlanta and even moving forward, right? I mean, I think they looked at the quarterback situation that they had last year, and I said this going into the free agency period. I bet Arthur Blank looked at what happened this past season and he was just like, never again. Don't care. We're gonna give Kirk Cousins whatever he wants. We're gonna give the best quarterback option whatever he wants to come to Atlanta, and it happened to be Kirk Cousins. I was right on that. I didn't know that I would also continue to be right when it came to the number 8 overall draft pick, and them continuing to not want to settle at the quarterback position. But it should be a great offense and a lot of fun to watch in Atlanta this year.
Before we get to the defense, which is where this sort of starts to all this optimism starts to run into a brick wall. If it doesn't work, why? I mean, the obvious reason would be if Kirk Cousins coming off of the Achilles, it takes him a while to come back. If he struggles, is there any other thing? Because you and I have been talking about how we feel like Cousins was such a great fit, and we're going to get the most like Kyle Pitts, and Zach Robinson was such a good hire, and I believe all of those things. Do you think that like is maybe the receiving group isn't enough, or like if there's anything that raises doubts about this offense, what would it be for you?
I mean, honestly, it might be like locker room morale might honestly be like the number one thing. Cause obviously like we've talked about Kirk Cousins and, like he was signed on to Atlanta to be like the guy. And then they draft Michael Pitts at number 8, or they draft Michael Penix at number 8. And it's like, okay, does he sort of like hold that against the organization? If things don't, what could really derail it for Atlanta is if they don't start great, like for whatever reason, if this team starts 2-4, is it just going to be turmoil? Are things going to just be turmoil though? Because remember, there's not a lot of built-in loyalty, right? Raheem Morris is the first-time head coach in Atlanta. Like Zach Robinson's is the first year in Atlanta. It's for Cousins' first year in Atlanta. Like it's everybody's first year in Atlanta. There's not a lot of just this built-in camaraderie, loyalty, trust, and I think everybody kind of feels that Kirk Cousins feels slighted by how they handled things this offseason. So the way that it doesn't work out for Atlanta is if Robinson and Raheem Morris go through maybe a little bit of an acclimation period as first-time offensive coordinator and head coach, and defensive mind. If those guys go through a 6-week, 8-week sort of acclimation period with this roster, do things start to unravel? Because for a lot of other teams, it maybe wouldn't be that big of a deal. If they don't draft Michael Penix, maybe that's not that big of a deal. But with him sitting there 6 weeks in, are people going to start clamoring that the season's over and they got to go to Penix, and then all of a sudden you're having to deal with all these things in the locker room? So that, to me, on paper, it's hard to see this offense not working. It's really hard to see this offense not working. But that, to me, is maybe something that has the potential to derail it.
Steelers, Eagles, Chiefs could be difficult. Then you get the division. Yeah, or maybe if the defense is so bad that your offense is put in a because this offense, I think we agree, will be at its best when threat of the run is on the table. Like we're talking about, I didn't even talk about Bijan Robinson or Tyler Algier, how good of a run blocking offensive line this is. The best version of this offense is one where teams are constantly put in run pass conflict. Just the hope is now that you actually have a quarterback who can execute on the pass side of things. Right. So let's talk about the defense because you got to get there. This is the group that in some ways actually did outperform last year with the previous defensive coordinator, Ryan Nielsen. Man, this is, as I'm looking at the depth chart, and coming off of we were talking about the Saints and the Bucs and the Panthers, the NFC South cannot rush the passer. Like there's no who is the best edge rusher in the entire NFC South? Cam Jordan?
I was gonna say, like, is it Granderson at this point? Like, is
Anderson?
it Cam Jordan? Edge rusher? Yeah, that's bad. Well, Clowney in theory, right?
Clowney?
I
Wow.
guess.
All right. So the Falcons, pardon me, ranked dead last in pass rush win last year. So pass rush win isn't like, totally followable. I mean, you got to look at a number of things, but they had a pass rush win rate of, so just, I always say this, it probably is worth reminding people what it is. It's basically ESPN's metric for if you beat your blocker in less than 2.5 seconds. And if you don't, then it's a win for the offensive lineman, pass block win rate. Hence, so their pass rush win rate as a team was 30.9%, which means they won 30.9% of the time. Dallas was 60%. That's so
Well, when
crazy.
you put it that way.
They were actually pretty decent against the run last year, though, and they under Ryan Nielsen, they played a fair amount of man coverage. The interior of the defensive line played well. Grady Jarrett before he got hurt. Onyemata, actually, I thought was a pretty good signing for them. You draft Rook Ororo with your first defensive pick, or your second round pick, who's a defensive tackle. I think defensive tackle could actually be a strength for this team. Zach Harrison's a solid player, but edge remains major question. You're looking at some combo of Lorenzo Carter, Ebiketie, Braylon Trice, who they drafted this year out of Washington. On the back end, these defenses are all so similar. Another elite safety, Jesse Bates.
Yeah.
AJ Terrell has been a little bit up and down. I think every other cornerback is like shorter than me on this team.
They got a lot of short corners.
Yeah. I think for Atlanta, and just kind of speaking more globally, again, there's a bit of a theme here. You just need this defense to be average, because I don't think either of us agree it's going to be one of the better defenses in the NFL.
Yeah, and it's an uphill battle for them, right? Because you're sort of looking to Grady Jarrett to continue to be the cornerstone of this defense. He's 31 coming off an ACL tear. So it's like, obviously, I hope that he comes back fully healthy, but it's like, man, you're on the north side of 30. You're coming off of an ACL tear. Even the Grady Jarrett aspect of this is sort of tough to say, yeah, it's going to be great going into this next season. AJ Terrell, I still think is a good corner in this league, but it's going to be a little bit of a defensive change. I have a lot of faith in Jesse Bates because I think he's one of the best safeties in the NFL, but I get worried about Clark Phillips, who I liked Clark Phillips a lot when he was coming out of the draft, but I liked him as like a slot corner, because he's a much smaller player. And right now I haven't been following Falcons like training camp notes or anything, but like the depth chart I'm looking at, he's starting outside. Like that's not great. And they've got D Alford as well as a potential nickelback for them, Mike Hughes. So I know has been a starter kind of like on and off. And it's like, there's just not a ton to hang your hat on with this group. And it felt like they tried to make up for not drafting a defensive lineman at number 8 with just a multitude of picks. And I'm not saying none of those dudes could work out. Like, I like Arroyo. I like Brandon Dorlus. I like Braylon Trice. Braylon Trice led the country in pressures last year, but they're all sort of...
It's not a plan.
Yeah, it's just like they're just throwing a bunch of guys, and they're like, "See, we tried to do it on the defensive line. We just drafted a bunch of people." It's like, I don't actually think that was your best course of action there. So I think Atlanta's defense maybe has less. Does Atlanta's defense? It's crazy to say this with the Panthers and how we opened up this show, but does Atlanta's defense have the least amount of star power?
I mean,
because the Panthers have Derek Brown, J.C. Horn, and Jadeveon Clowney. In theory, there's 3. The Falcons have, in theory,
Terrell and Bates. I guess it depends on how you regard Grady coming off the injury, and I still think Terrell's a very good player.
I do too. I think he's a good player. But this kind of just goes back to Grady Jarrett essentially holds the key for this defense, because if he's not in Grady Jarrett form that we've seen throughout the rest of his career, it'd get ugly quick.
Yeah. It by the way, just to kind of put a pin on this all, it makes it really hard to power rank this division, because I think the Falcons will have the best offense, but I also think
Yes.
they could it could absolutely happen that they have the worst defense. So where does that leave us, Trevor? This is tricky. You go first, and then I will tell you how I feel.
I go back and forth. So I will preface this by saying I
I've
picked
gone
the
back and
Saints to win the division last year. And
Which
obviously
they was so
right. And I mean, like
tight.
they tied for it. Just obviously the Bucs won the tiebreaker there. I when I look at this division, I kind of have to give the Bucs the benefit of the doubt as the incumbent, and I will take Tampa to win this division because I have a lot more faith in what is returning for Tampa and sort of the familiarity of what they have and how they can even improve on the things that didn't go well for them last year as a team that won the division. Now, they weren't a runaway to win the division, I'll admit that, but the stability of Tampa, I have more faith in. I would say Atlanta comes in second in the division. New Orleans, I'll have third, and then Carolina, I still have as a pretty clear fourth for that team. So that's I think Atlanta probably has the highest ceiling of any
Yeah,
team,
that's
but
why I'm going Atlanta at 1 because of the ceiling of that offense. Because I do think the offense on paper has the potential to be a top 10 unit.
I agree.
But the defense on paper should be a bottom 10 unit. So whereas I think the Bucs, I've been doing these power rankings and the Bucs keep landing like in the middle and like that feels right, or like kind of in that 15 to 20-ish range. The Saints, the trenches thing just bothers me way too much, especially the offensive line. I think it's just like a real code red situation unless Fuanka completely surprises. And then the Panthers, everybody agrees, are a rebuilding team. This year is not about winning games. It's about getting competent quarterback play and feeling like you can get a better feel of who Bryce Young is. That's it. That's the NFC South. I am excited to see how this division pans out. I would not be. I feel like these teams could finish in any order, maybe outside of Carolina winning, and I would be not surprised. But I'm excited to see it. Trevor, before I let you go, can you let everybody know where they can find your work?
Yes, pff.com is where you can find all of my work as well as my coworkers' work. We are already chugging along for the 2025 NFL draft. And by the time the college football and NFL seasons are going to come around, we're going to have over 150 players that are already in the mock draft simulator. So whenever you want to be like, let me take a peek into what the next class might be like, we'll have like strength and weaknesses for you. We'll have the mock draft simulator all updated for you. So we're working hard to get that ready. Oh, and then also if you're a big fantasy football player out there, no matter what league you're in, we got a lot of really great tools as well as a fantasy mock draft simulator as well, which you guys can prep like a pro to get ready for all of your leagues. So that's everything I got going over at pff.com.
So I mentioned I have Rattler in my Dynasty League, which is with Nate Tice, Jackson Bevins, Danny Kelly, who are guys who I've had on the show. My first pick this year was Xavier Worthy.
Okay.
And part because I have Kelsey and he's been like my stalwart. Kelsey has like carried me to the finals every year, but I was like, this is kind of like a hedge because I was torn between him and Keon Coleman. But as Lenny barks, I gotta say that clip of the bomb, Patrick Mahomes throwing that bomb to Xavier Worthy. I've been spamming the group chat. Just hand me the championship now, guys. I'm feeling so good about it.
That Xavier Worthy truly has the ability to absolutely wreck some leagues this year with Patrick Mahomes just doing the F it Worthy's down there somewhere kind of throws. So I think you're in a good spot.
Him and Rattler. Come on, let's get some Rattler. Thank you, as always, to my guest, to the fine folks at Omaha Productions for working on this podcast. Kirsten Sebecki, Anthony Jimenez, Owen Saylor, Jack Foster, Charlie Kravitz, who works on our YouTube. Also, one quick note, according to the aforementioned producers, I have been nominated for a podcast award, Best Female Host, for the People's Choice Podcast Awards, Lenny Erasure, but that's fine. You can vote. But I guess you have to register. Sorry, but apparently it's very quick. So I'm going to post a link to that in the notes of this podcast, and maybe I'll tweet it out too. You can also check this podcast out on YouTube at youtube.com/@MinaKimes. Otherwise, I will be back early next week with Chris Long.